In a previous video on this channel, I addressed a lot of the different challenges I've faced when it comes to making money 3D printing. And on that video, I received a lot of feedback. And there were a ton of comments on how I actually could improve my 3D printer to make it perform better. So therefore, I want to take the opportunity to take a closer look at the comments on that video and apply those upgrades to my printer so we can see how much of a difference these upgrades actually make. And as you can see on the printer, it doesn't really have a lot of functional upgrades done to it, other than the drawers for storage, the screen cover, and the fan cover. That is basically it. The rest of the upgrades done to this printer are just cosmetics and are there for one single reason: to look good. So therefore I thought it was time to actually get done some real upgrades to this printer. But before we jump into the upgrades, I want to do a quick benchmark to see how much time this printer, without any upgrades, takes to print this battery mount. This is something that I've printed a lot of times before, but for the sake of science, let's just do it one more time so we can properly compare the results before and after the upgrades. Let's start printing. I'm guessing that only took a few seconds, but in reality that was actually pretty close to 5.5 hours. 5 hours and 19 minutes to be exact. And in the last video when I said that this print took me 7 hours, based on the feedback that I got, that seemed to be a very long time. So I definitely hope there's room for improvement. We're gonna take a closer look at this benchmarking print a little later in the video and compare it to the benchmarking print made by the printer with the upgrades and actually see if we're able to reduce the print time without compromising on print quality and the robustness of the print, since this is a battery mount and it's supposed to hold some weight. Now that that's out of the way, we can move on to the upgrades, and we have quite a few to go through. And as you probably can see by the packaging on these parts, these are ordered from AliExpress. And I was really considering whether or not to do that or not, but when looking at the price difference compared to Norwegian sites, I ended up ordering from AliExpress. So just bear that in mind, and it's going to be really interesting to see the quality of these parts. So let's get started. Starting with the first upgrade, we have the extruder kit. And as you can see, this is made out of all metal. And comparing it to the one that came with the printer, which is made out of plastic, this one is supposed to last a lot longer, since the plastic one has a tendency to crack up. The biggest difference between this one and the previous one is that this has a dual pulley system, which reduces the chance of slipping on the filament quite a lot. Moving on to the next one, we have the CHT nozzle. And this nozzle is made in a way that allows it to transfer the heat from the extruder over to the filament a lot better than a standard brass nozzle. Now it's time for the Raspberry Pi, and this was very difficult to get a hold of since it's basically sold out everywhere. I ended up installing the Raspberry Pi in a printed part, which I found on Thingiverse, and I'll make sure to leave that in the description. The silicone rubber spacers replaces the springs that comes with the printer and are supposed to help keep the bed leveled after many times of printing. I also ordered 4 red aluminum wheels, which fits the color scheme perfectly. Installing the glass bed was pretty simple, just removing the old one and placing it on the heated bed. Now moving on to the silent motherboard, and comparing this one to the one that comes stock with the printer is that this one is a lot more silent. And it also has a header on the motherboard for the BL Touch, which I thought was a perfect upgrade to make since we were also installing a BL Touch. Last but not least, we have the 3D touch sensor, and this was pretty simple to install since we already have a dedicated port for it on the new motherboard. The most difficult part was actually routing the cable from the extruder down to the motherboard. Now that everything has been installed, it's time to finally see what the printer looks like. Now that all of the parts have been installed, it's time to go on the computer and configure the machine. This meaning that we have to download Clipper to the Raspberry Pi so that we actually can print with the machine. I have to admit that this definitely was the most time-consuming part of the process, since I ran into a few hiccups along the way. And the first one being that I had a really hard time actually getting into the Clipper web interface. The thing that was causing me to not get into the web interface was actually my browser blocking it. I also had a really hard time getting the Raspberry Pi and the motherboard in the printer to communicate together. And what was causing this was actually the USB cable that I was using. And when I switched around, everything was working fine, but it took a pretty long time before I actually realized that this was the problem. After many hours of trial and error, I think we're on the right track. The printer is now up and running, and it's time to perform our first official benchmarking print to see how the performance of this machine actually is. So let's see it. After some time, the printer is now finished printing, and this took 3 hours and 6 minutes. And this is a pretty good improvement from 5 hours and 19 minutes, which we had previously. But there was something that I realized when it started printing, and we'll take a closer look at that in a second. But first, I just wanted to mention that the biggest difference that I have realized so far is definitely the sound it makes, and this all happened when I changed the motherboard on the printer from the old one to the silent one, which is the new one. The printer previously had a very high-pitched sound, which was extremely annoying to listen to. But when running the first print on this printer, I almost didn't even realize that it was running and had started, since the only thing you can hear from this printer when it's printing is that the fans are running. That's basically it. There's no like high-pitched mechanical noise or something like that coming from the motherboard, which is very weird when I'm actually used to the sound from the old printer or the old motherboard. Taking a closer look at the print, we can definitely see that this is far from perfect. The first thing that you notice is definitely the layer lines, which you can clearly see on this new one that we have printed. But I don't think that this is because of the upgrades that were made. Rather it being that I haven't taken enough time to actually tune the settings in my slicer well enough. So therefore we can see a pretty big and significant difference when it comes to print quality. But when just looking at the time it took to print, with both of them being at 0.28 layer height and 20% infill, this one took 5 hours and 19 minutes, and this one took 3 hours and 6 minutes. So when it comes to just looking at the speed, we have been able to reduce the print time quite a lot. So now we just have to tune it so that we're able to get rid of these layer lines and make this print actually look more like the print that we had before all of the upgrades, since this actually is a very good print when it comes to print quality. It just took a very long time to print it. After seeing the results that I just showed you, I went back to my computer in order to see if I was able to adjust and tune the settings in my slicer so that I will be getting better results prints with the new machine. And I've done some printing, and it's time to take a closer look at the benchmarking prints, starting with the first one. This was done without any of the upgrades, and it was done in 5 hours and 19 minutes. And as you can see on the print, it is a very nice finish all around, and it's overall a very good print. It is very hard to see the individual layer lines, and the letters are incredibly good. They are sharp and easy to read, and there are no ghosting around them at all. There's really not a lot to say about this print, since it's a really good one. Moving on to the next one, this was the first one after having installed all of the upgrades. And this took only 2 hours and 13 minutes, which is a lot less than the first one, about 3 hours. But upon further inspection, I realized that there was a major loss in print quality. As you can see, there is very noticeable layer lines all across the print, really. The letters themselves look okay, but there is some ghosting around them, and there is also a little under extrusion here. So even though that this printed 3 hours faster than the previous one, I was not really satisfied with this result at all. Since this print was printed in only 2 hours and 13 minutes, I thought that this issue had to have something to do with the fact that I was printing fast. So therefore I decided to do another benchmarking print, just a little slower. And that's when I ended up with this. This one is printed in 2 hours and 49 minutes, and you can see that there is still the same problem. There is very visible layer lines, and the letters aren't really any better at all. And overall, this pretty much looks identical to the previous one, and if there is any improvement at all, it is very minor. This is printed with 20% infill, as well as the previous one and the original one. These are all printed with 20% infill and 0.28 layer height. And you can still see the layer lines, and they are very visible. There are still some under extrusion, but it's not that bad. And yeah, now that I'd increased the print time with about 30 minutes, and I was still seeing the same layer line issue, I began wondering if there was something else that was causing this problem. And upon printing the next benchmark, I actually noticed something. When it was printing, I saw that the glass bed was sliding a lot back and forth. The clips that I used on the old flexible bed wasn't big enough to fit around the glass bed, since this is a lot thicker. So therefore I just ended up using some electrician's tape, and at first I thought this was going to be strong enough to do the job, but after having done some prints, I did realize and I saw that this was not enough, since the glass bed was sliding a lot back and forth. And then I realized that this was probably the thing that was causing these layer lines not to match up correctly. So therefore I decided to do another one of this print, but this time making sure that the glass bed was secured to the heated bed. So this is what we ended up with. This took 2 hours and 30 minutes, and you can quickly see that there is a big improvement when it comes to the layer lines. These are a lot less visible now, and it's overall a much nicer print. Having them side by side, you can definitely see the difference. And the corners are a lot nicer on this new one. And this one was printed in 2 hours and 30 minutes. But these ones are basically printed at the same time. And you can therefore still see that there is a big difference. So therefore the thing that was actually causing this was most likely the bed sliding around. But after having secured it to the heated bed with a lot of clips, this was the new result. They are both printed with 20% infill and a layer height of 0.28. The letters are almost the same. There is a bit of ghosting on both of them, but this on the right still has a lot nicer finish all around, and overall it is a much better print than this one. As you can see, there is another color on the top of it, and that's just because I ran out of light gray filament. So when I had a print with decent print quality done in 2 hours and 30 minutes, I wanted to see how fast I actually could print this model. And that's when I ended up with this one. And of course you can see that I did run out of gray filament. So this one is done completely in red filament. This was done in as little as 1 hour and 26 minutes. And comparing it to the original, it is about 4 hours faster, which is pretty incredible to think about. And when looking a little closer at it, we definitely can see that there is some reduction in print quality comparing it to the original. But I would say as a functional print, this is definitely doable. This has 15% infill and a layer height of 0.44. And the fact that this was printed in 1 hour and 26 minutes is actually pretty insane. This basically means that you can print 3.5 of these ones in the same time it takes to print one of these. And especially when it comes to a functional print like this one, which doesn't really need a lot of details, that is pretty insane, and that's a huge difference. And before having installed and bought all of the new upgrades to the printer, I never expected that I was going to be able to print this model in 1 hour and 30 minutes. So that is actually really cool to see. I did also print another benchmarking print, this one being a calibration cube, and this is the first one, and this is far from perfect. This has a lot of under extrusion, and as you can see with the first of these prints as well, it also has very visible layer lines. But this was of course before I figured out that the glass bed was sliding back and forth a lot. And you can also see that there's a lot of under extrusion, and this is the first one that I actually printed, and this is the third one. You can see that there's a lot less under extrusion. And what I did in order to fix this was actually tune it in the slicer, and I set the flow from, I think it was around 90% to 100%, and this actually did end up solving the under extrusion. You can see this was the final print that I did of this calibration cube, this being the first one and this being the last one, and you can see that there's basically no under extrusion in the last one, comparing it to this one, which has a lot. This also was on one of the sides, and I guess it's that one. That's the same side of the cube, and there's a big difference between them. So after having inspected the benchmarking prints, there is a very big difference when it comes to print time. This actually being printed 4 hours faster than this one, and I would never expect it to actually be able to print that fast. When it comes to the installation part, the physical installation of the process was pretty straightforward, but when it came to the software part or the programming part, where I had to get Clipper to work with the printer, I did run into a few issues, and this took a pretty long time comparing it to actually just installing it physically. And when setting up Clipper, I actually ended up breaking one of the bed leveling sensors, so there's that. And that was actually because I ended up using the wrong sensor pin for the BL Touch, so that it didn't recognize that it was ramming into the glass bed. But fortunately I ordered 2 of them, so I just swapped it out with the new one. Another issue that I did run into when setting up Clipper was that I really had a hard time connecting the Raspberry Pi to the motherboard of the printer after having flashed the motherboard. I was on the Clipper website main sale, and I did not seem to be able to communicate with the motherboard at all, and I tried a lot of stuff, and it ended up actually being the USB cable. At some point I just figured that I would just swap them around and see if that would, you know, make any difference, and boom, then it suddenly worked, and it was a very big relief, but also very infuriating. And even though I didn't end up using the fancy CHT nozzle since it was way too long, I have swapped to a 0.6 Creality brass nozzle, and from what I've read, this seems to be the better choice to have a 0.6 nozzle over a 0.4. So even though I didn't end up using the CHT nozzle, it was an upgrade either way. When I ordered all of these upgrades, I made sure to buy parts that already had a lot of orders and reviews on them already. And if you're considering whether or not to buy from AliExpress, that's at least my experience with them, and it has so far been very good. All of the parts that I've received have been working as they should, and none of them came damaged, as well as the shipping only taking 1 week, which actually surprised me quite a lot. Last but not least, I want to thank everybody that commented on the last 3D printer video and suggested all of these cool new upgrades for my 3D printer. And I hope you learned a thing or two in this video and that you enjoyed watching it. And I'll see you in the next one.